Good evening and welcome back to our weekly Shiur, question and answers for anash.org. This week, Mi'ez Hashem, Friday, will be Rosh Adar. It's going to be Friday and Shabbos. So I want to address a question which comes up every time when Rosh Chodesh is on Friday. Are you permitted to cut your nails lekvod Shabbos? Now we know there's a tzvus Rabbi Dachuset Simon Memches that a person should not cut his nails and cut his hairs on Rosh Chodesh. So the question is, if it falls Erev Shabbos, which is lekvod Shabbos, can you cut your nails and your hair, or you cannot? And the answer to this is like this. The Mungavruam, in the beginning of Siman Reish Samach, in the Alter Rebbe also in beginning of Siman Reish Samach, Mecha Shabbos, writes that when Rosh Chodesh falls on Friday, you should not cut your hair. That means it brings down yesh mekoimos shenahagi, that you don't cut your hair, and it means that we go according to this minik. But it does not mention that you should not cut your nails. It only mentions you shouldn't cut your hair. So b'pashtus the Alter Rebbe is mavir that only hair you shouldn't cut on Rosh Chodesh when it falls on Erev Shabbos, but nails you could cut since it's lekvod Shabbos. And this is how we pasken, especially for people who cut their nails every week. Like the Sefer Shivim Temorim, we know there's a Talmud of the Tzemach Tzedek wrote a Sefer on Tzvus Rabbi Dachuset, and he writes in Siman Ni'en Vuv that a person which cuts his nail every week has no problem to cut his nail Friday when it's Rosh Chodesh. Other poskim will say that even if you don't cut it every week, even if you cut it every other week, you can still cut it on Rosh Chodesh. But Al Kapurim, the Shivim Temorim, and other poskim say a person which cuts every week, he for sure could cut, according to the Alter Rebbe, the Mungavruam, when it falls on Rosh Chodesh. Now the Mishnah Berurah does not pass like this, and he asers if Rosh Chodesh falls on Friday. But again, we go according to the Alter Rebbe, and according to the Alter Rebbe, a person which cuts every week the nails has no problem cutting it this week Friday, which is Rosh Chodesh. Now to the next question, which could come up a lot. I won't say a lot, but it comes up. Shabbos im Yirtzeh Hashem will be Rosh Chodesh, and it will be Shabbos Kulam. So we take out 3 Sefer Toras. Now, first of all, a shul which does not have 3 Sefer Toras, if they have 2 Sefer Toras, they let me just say how the Seder will be. First of all, we take out 3 Sefer Toras, a shul which has, and we lay 6 people from Parshas HaShavua, which will be Parshas Mishpatim. Shvi is going to be Parshas Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, the piece which we lay every Rosh Chodesh. Third Sefer Torah, which we take out, will be to lay Parshas Kulam. The Haftorah is going to be from Parshas Kulam, and you add on a posik, first posik and the last posik of the Haftorahs of Rosh Chodesh. Now a shul which has only 2 Sefer Torahs, they learn in the first Sefer Torah, then they learn the second Sefer Torah, Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. In the meantime that you learn Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, you should roll the first Sefer Torah to Parsha Shkulim, and you learn in the first Sefer Torah again, Parsha Shkulim. Because you should roll it when they learn Parshas Rosh Chodesh, because we know there's such thing as Terchet de Tzabira. Your own, if you can avoid rolling it while people have to wait, you do it and you don't make people wait. Now, the question will be, which happens, a person took a shul which has 3 Sefer Torahs. So, by mistake, they opened up the Sefer Torah which you have to learn for Shabbat Shkulim, and they opened it, and after learning Parshas Shavua, instead of learning Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, they started learning Shabbat Shkulim. So what do you do then? Then you finish, and you take the other Sefer Torah, which should be number 2, and you learn Shabbat Rosh Chodesh after you learn Shkulim. That means, even though usually it goes Shabbat, Parshas Shavua, Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, and then you go to Parshas Shkulim, if by mistake you changed the Seder, and after Parshas Shavua you started learning already, after the Brochas, you started learning Shabbat Shkulim, you should finish the which you learn for Shkulim, and you take the second Sefer Torah, the third Sefer Torah, and you learn Rosh Chodesh. But what are you going to do about the Haftorah? Do you learn the Haftorah of Shkulim, or you learn the Haftorah which you just finished? Now the Sharafrayim and the Mishnah Berurah, Siman Tuf Resh Pai Hai, Sif Kuten Hai, Chivas Noide Bihide, Tanina Simid Aleph writes that in such a case that you learn first Shkulim and then Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, the Haftorah should be Hashemayim Kisi, which is the Haftorah for Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, because you have to learn the Haftorah on the Parsha which you learned the last. And since over here we changed the Sefer Torah and we learned last Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, you should basically learn the Haftorah also for Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. Now, not all the poskim agree with it. Some poskim say you should still learn Shkolim, but this is the Askumas HaPoskim that you should learn the Haftorah from Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. Next question. Last week we spoke about not eating before going to the oil, and one of the questions was, what is if I go at night and I didn't eat from the shkia, is that okay? And I mentioned I didn't see any makor for such a hanuga that should be acceptable. So somebody wrote in today, this week, that he went shortly after Gimel Tamas, he went to the oil with Rabbi Yoel Khan, the Rebbe's Chayzer, and they were discussing how a nash started to go to the oil at night. And Rabbi Yoel asked a simple question: if you go at night, what do you do about not eating? That means you fast all day? So we see at least that Bapashtas, he took it for granted that even if you go at night, you still have to fast and not eat all day. So again, going back to the question, we see at least that Rabbi Yoel holds also that not eating from the shkia is not enough. Another follow-up, a reference to saying Tillim at night. So the question was, what about if you started by the day, and in the middle of saying Tillim, it became the Tzesek Chuvim? And the answer is there's no difference. If you don't say Tillim and the Tzesek Chuvim, so even if you started beforehand, when it comes to Tzesek Chuvim, you should stop. Next question. If one benches licht on the table, and is there any way to move the tray later to put on a fresh tablecloth? From what I understand, to put on a sefer on the tray is meaningless, because the leichter tray is designated a basis for the candles. Is that so? Now, it's not that pashut. No. It depends what kind of tray you're talking about. If it is a small tray, which is really designated just for the Shabbos candles, so then you're right. And since it's made only for the candles, it's designated for the candles, so it becomes a basis for the candles, and you cannot move it even if you put a sefer. But if you have a silver tray, which is the bigger tray, and a lot of trays is like this, the bigger trays, and over there you have the candles, you have where you put the matches, and over there people, it is made, that tray is made, people put on top also a sefer. If he doesn't want, it should be on the place, on the table, which is chomasdik, and he wants to keep his svarim clean, he will put it on top of that tray because there's place for other things. Or he uses the tray for other things too. People use the tray for other things. If they decorate for a simcha, they'll put it in the middle to put on the glasses, the cups, if they could use it for a pidyon aben. Such a tray, Reb Shlomo Zalman holds that it is not, does not get a basis for the lachter, and therefore, if you put on a sefer, since it's not designated only for the lachter, of course, every Shabbos usually you use it for the lachter, but you could also use it for a sefer or for something else, and people do use it for something else. It will be fine to move it if you have, even once it doesn't burn anymore, so then you can still use it. Now, not everybody agrees with Reb Shlomo Zalman. I think the Rebbe Yashav doesn't agree, but at least Reb Shlomo Zalman holds that you could use it because it's not dedicated only for the lachter. In Mamukum HaTzoyrech, you could use it. You could use this heter. But if it's a small tray which is made dedicated only for the candles, you are right that putting on a cipher somehow it won't help. It should not become a basis. Question: sprouted grain is dried by heat, but it remains flour. The question is there a chashash of pas akim? And the answer is yes. We mentioned it already, but the previous shirim, sprouted grain has the loch of regular grain. It is regular flour, and if you bake it, it is, if a non-Jew bakes it, it's pas akim, and it has to be pas Yisrael. So it's like regular bread, and there's no different if it's sprouted or not. Question: a rabbi opened the shul in a besmedrash, opened the shul in a 3-story home that he rents from other Yid. He lives on top floor, and the middle floor he opened a besmedrash, a shul. The lease ends in September. The rent was always paid promptly. Can the Jewish landlord is planning to sell this property to another Yid? Can the rabbi have the right not to be evicted since he has a shul in the property? He certainly will pay rent on time, but since he has a shul, maybe you cannot evict him. And the answer to this question is no, he has no right at all. He rented this place with the lease. Once the lease is over, the balabos has the right to do anything. And if he sells it, he could evict this tenant. Kemivn, he has to evict him according to halacha, according to how much time he has to give for someone else. But it is not a sibba not to evict. It's not a reason not to evict a person because he opened the shul. I assume the question will also be, so if he closes a shul, if there is a problem of closing a shul. But this, we know already, the achronim, that in a town which there's a lot of shuls, and if you don't have this shul, you can go down to other shul. It is not a problem. and that rabbi who rented this apartment and made a shul over there should rent another apartment and made a shul there. But he has no right to say that since I have a shul here, you cannot evict me. Next question. Can I wear earmuffs on Shabbos, or is it the same as gloves? No, it's not the same as gloves. You could wear, and people wear it every Shabbos of winter. It's a baguette, you could wear it. Gloves, we have a problem, because when you give Shalom Aleichem for a friend, you're going to take it off. And that's why we are makbid not to wear gloves if it's not connected to your coat. But earmuffs is the same as a shawl, and people do not take it off in the middle of the winter when it stops, even when it stops talking to someone else. So therefore, you could wear earmuffs on Shabbos, even a place where there's no Erev. Question. Is it okay to drink whiskey aged in sherry casks? Is the wine flavor bottle, pogam, v'chulu? The answer to this question is, it is discussed a lot in the Poskim Achroinam, there's a tshuva min Chasitzchag, in other places. There are some Poskim which will be more lenient, but the minig b'chsidem, Achsidish Yid, does not go into this oldest atayram, especially when talking about wine. Befrat Chsidei Chabad, which we know, Chsidei Chabad, the Indian of Yain, Neisich Yain, Shel Akim, was a big chumrah, and therefore, Achsidish Yid should not drink whiskey which is aged in sherry oak casks. And now, yes, there are some people in some poskim which are michael, but it's not a thing in Befrat, especially today's day, which there are a lot of whiskeys which is kosher and is on the kashr's lists. There's no reason that you should go into doichkem and drink things which is not 100% chaladais. After all, Chassidish Yidden have to be makbet, kalaki chamira, what to take out, what to take into their mouth. Question. Can you please explain if cereal needs to be pas Yisrael or Bishul Yisrael? This is a common question, especially shluchim, which they live all over, and it's not that easy to buy cereals, morning cereals which you eat for breakfast, which has Bishul Yisrael. If you live in the tri-state area, you could buy, but not everybody could buy. So what is the halacha? Now, Rav Eliyashiv holds that it goes into the gather of pas, and therefore, if it's not, if you don't have a yid which opens the fire, it's pas akim, pas palter, and it needs to be pas Yisrael, so therefore, it is a problem. Now, most poskim do not agree with this, that goes into gather of pas. Because if it goes into the pas, you don't have that item of oila shilchem menuchem anisht. If it goes on the table of a king, that means a fancy meal, a meal which is where you serve by a chasana or by a fancy hotel, you don't have all this attire. You have the heter of some people, like Alter Rebbe writes, some people are b'chal makbid of pas palter. But as Chassidim, we are not lenient on pas palter. So therefore, if it goes into the gather of pas, you have no way out. But most poskim hold it goes into the gather of bishul. So it needs to be bishul Yisrael. That's the question, or not bishul Yisrael. Now, by bishul akim, we know one of the things is that if it does not go on shulchan malachim, that means if it's not served in a nice setting, a nice suda, a nice didder, there is no problem of bishul akim. Now, oila shulchan malachim, there is a shaila in the poskim. What does it mean? For sure, in a armen of a king, in a palace of a king, the children will also eat, and maybe even the king himself by his breakfast table, he might maybe eat also these kind of cereals in his private private breakfast. Now the question is, if it is so, will that be considered oila shel chameluchim or not? So some poskim say, yes, since a king will also eat this kind of cereals, so then it needs to be bishul Yisrael. But a lot of poskim say no, it has to be in a fancy setting, in a mechibadige setting, in a setting which a king will be mechabat someone else, and as I mentioned already in the previous shiurim, it means if you will serve it by a chasana, if you will serve it by a fancy meal. So if you don't want to serve this fancy meal, that's not considered bishul oila shel chameluchim, and doesn't need to be bishul Yisrael. Now, most of the kashrus organizations try, especially the Chassidische, try, and they have a mashgiach there, and they're machmer that there should be bishul Yisrael. And it's kedai to be machmer if you can. But in a shliach, which is somewhere in a place which he has a Costco or he has a ShopRite, and he could buy Cheerios from without Chassidische hechsher, there is place to be Michael and be lenient to use it. If you live in a place where you have with a hechsher, which is bishul Yisrael, of course you should aim to buy that one. But if you live in a place which you don't have these things, you could be Michael that it's not a thing which you need bishul Yisrael, it's not oila shel chameluchim, and you could eat it even though it is just with a hechsher without bishul Yisrael. Okay, we're going to stop here, and please join us next week, and please send in your questions to inbox@anash.org. Good night, and have a wonderful week.